In February of 1979, a small fishing boat was off the coast of Maui when a massive storm quickly approached. Despite the efforts of the Coast Guard and the island's residents, the boat was thought to have been lost in the storm. However, a decade later, thousands of miles away, the boat was discovered, and what was found with it was far more horrifying and mysterious than anyone could have imagined. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Ralph Maliakini woke up to an absolutely perfect Hawaiian morning on February 11th, 1979. It was Sunday, but the 27-year-old had to head directly to a construction job to do some work with his friend and coworker Pat Wasner. After a quick bite, Ralph headed out the door and noticed how gorgeous the day was. It was a comfortable 70 degrees or 21 Celsius that morning without a cloud in the sky, and it was less windy than typical in the small town of Hana on the northeastern coast of Maui. Ralph then got into his truck and started his short commute through the streets of the town often referred to as the last Hawaiian place for its undeveloped surroundings and isolation. There's one road in and out of Hana called the Hana Highway, and the highway itself is a bit of an obstacle. With more than 50 miles of twisting, turning road, the Hana Highway used to be so rough on vehicles that rental car companies used to prohibit driving it. At the same time, though, it's some of the most beautiful driving in the world, as it passes stunning coastlines, thick rainforest, and several waterfalls. And for a little more context on how isolated Hana truly is, it's literally near nothing. The closest shopping center is 52 miles away, and the only gas pump in town during the late 1970s was at a general store. Long ago, Hana was a sugar plantation, and about 100 of the old plantation-style homes built back then were occupied by some of Hana's few hundred residents. Its remote location and small population made it a tight-knit community with an old-fashioned way of doing things. Now, kind of surprisingly, there was no commercial fishing fleet in Hana. This is because the waters surrounding it, namely the Alanuahaha Channel, are considered some of the roughest waters anywhere in the world. The channel alone reaches 6,000 feet deep, and just outside the channel reaches up to 20,000 in an area known as the Hawaiian Trough. Because the wind travels across the Pacific unimpeded, the channel is known for regular extreme wind speeds, massive waves, and a powerful surface current. As a result, it's simply too dangerous for commercial operations compared to other areas around the islands. This actually created an interesting custom though. When the surrounding ocean was uncharacteristically calm, it was customary in Hana for work to take a backseat to fishing. When Ralph drove by and saw Hana Bay so calm, he immediately turned off his route and headed off to see some friends. He then rounded up Pat, Peter Hanchett, Benny Kalama, and Scott Moorman. Work was then canceled for the day, and the five friends would be going fishing instead. Hana's size as a town meant that no one would go unnoticed, but even if that wasn't the case, the five men would stick out. Ranging in age from the mid-20s to late 30s, the five friends were products of their generation, with some of them having long hair, unkempt beards, and bushy mustaches. After Ralph told the other four about going fishing, he drove to his twin brother's house, Robert. Robert owned a 17-foot Boston whaler that Ralph often borrowed. It wasn't much, just your standard run-of-the-mill fishing boat. It was bright blue, had a backup engine, a steering wheel, and a CB radio. As basic as the vessel looked though, it was surprisingly durable. One of the reasons Robert bought that model was because the manufacturer advertised in TV commercials at the time that it was unsinkable. When it came time to name it, he combined his parents' first names and dubbed it the Sarah Joe. Ralph spoke with his brother for a few minutes and let him know he was taking the boat before hitching the trailer to his truck and heading off to meet the other four at a general store. Ralph needed to pick up some supplies, so it was a convenient meeting spot. He then went inside and picked up a few spark plugs, some drinks to fill the coolers, and bags of ice for their fish. That day, they were hoping to catch some giant drac kavale, or a lua, which can weigh nearly 300 pounds. If they managed to catch enough of them, they planned to sell some to the general store and then divvy up the rest between family and friends. When they got to Hana Bay after parking the truck, Ralph climbed aboard and the five friends were soon driving out of Hana Bay just before 10 o'clock. Ralph was taking them to a spot where he had a lot of luck catching a lua. Less than 2 hours later though, the wind shifted direction and picked up strength. By 1 o'clock, winds had increased to gale force with sustained speeds of more than 35 miles per hour, and the skies opened up, dumping more than an inch of rain on Hana in an hour. Friends and family of the five men immediately became concerned when the weather intensified. Some of them started arriving in Hana Bay as the storm continued to rage, hoping to eventually see the Sarah Joe coming back around the corner. 3 larger fishing boats that had gone out with the same idea of spending the day fishing returned with shaken crew members. One of the men told the families that he had never seen the channel like it was right then. He described it as a raging river. A day earlier, the National Weather Service issued a small boat warning for heavy rain and 20-foot seas through Sunday. You might be wondering why anyone would go fishing with a forecast like that, but Hana's isolated location made weather reports difficult to come by. Hana had no TV stations, and the radio stations that did come on would issue weather reports for only the more populated areas of Maui. Even if any of the men did happen to hear about the small boat warning though, it would have made no difference. The channel was under a small boat warning almost every day, and heavy rain was nothing new out there either. In fact, just a month earlier, a storm came through that was intense enough to sink an 80-foot research ship in the channel and kill 2 of its crewmen. Somewhat ominously for the Sarah Joe though, the storm now battering Hana made that one look like a passing shower. When the Sarah Joe didn't return by 5 o'clock, it was reported missing to the local police, who notified the US Coast Guard. A helicopter was then dispatched, and they diverted an aircraft from another mission to start looking for the men. However, the storm was still raging as night fell, making visibility from the air near zero. Several locals also hopped in their boats and headed out to the channel as cars continued to show up with concerned residents and loved ones. Peter's father was on one of those boats going out to look for his son. When his boat returned to Hana Bay with no luck, the report he gave the rest of the families was chilling. The channel weather was the worst he'd ever been in. Swells apparently topped 40 feet, and the big ones caused boats to go almost vertical. The swells were so large that the Sarah Joe could have been 50 yards from them and they wouldn't have seen it. Early the next morning, boats went back out to resume the search. Robert was on one and Peter's father was on another, with marine biologist John Naughton, who joined the search effort. The search would need as many eyes as possible, but for the second day, there was no sign of the boat or the men aboard. The Coast Guard, meanwhile, continued to search for the Sarah Joe by air in the ensuing days. Using 44 planes over the course of the search, the Coast Guard covered more than 70,000 square miles of ocean and logged 330 hours of flying time. It was the largest sea search to ever take place in Hawaii, and it was about to become the most controversial. After 5 days of searching and nothing to show for it, the Coast Guard called it off, which stunned relatives and friends. They were already upset with the Coast Guard and what they saw as a half-hearted effort. According to them, the Coast Guard was constantly one step behind the Sarah Joe. They said they ignored the strong northerly winds that day, which would have carried the Sarah Joe the same direction before the wind died down and the surface current pushed the boat back to the southwest. The families also questioned why the search effort seemed to reach a peak during the first 2 days, which were hampered by bad weather, and then waned once visibility improved. The Coast Guard, however, stood by the search effort and felt it was as thorough as it could have been given the circumstances. There were only 5 people in the entire world who knew where the men went after they passed the rock island in Hana Bay, and all of them were on the Sarah Joe. Unfortunately, Ralph never told anyone where his favorite fishing spot was located, and the blue interior of the Sarah Joe further complicated search efforts from the air. It wasn't even a needle in a haystack, it was a blue dot in a vast blue ocean. What made this worse is that the residents believed that the 5 men were healthy and athletic enough to weather the storm and find a way to survive. Giving up the search so soon would doom them if they were out there waiting to be rescued. Reports also came in that the Sarah Joe made a distress call as the storm got started. A radio hobbyist in Hana claimed to have heard one of the men identify as the Sarah Joe and say that their engine died. Another reported hearing something similar. If these reports were true, the Sarah Joe could have just been disabled and subject to wherever the current was taking it. The Coast Guard, however, once again disagreed and determined that the reports of a distress call were false. So, less than a week after the men went missing, the Coast Guard pronounced them dead, presumed drowned at sea. The Hana community, as you might imagine, refused to accept this. A massive effort among its residents got underway. Families, friends, and strangers donated a total of $50,000 to hire commercial boats and private planes to join the extended search. Residents with boats searched sunrise to sunset for days. Those without boats or the means to donate walked countless miles of shoreline to assist in the effort. After a month of this, though, the money ran out, and the only thing the search uncovered was a life jacket on a beach that didn't belong to the Sarah Joe. A full year would pass before family, friends, and residents could accept the reality enough to hold a memorial service for the men. Hana picked up the pieces of its broken community and began to heal as best as it could. In the years that followed, no tips came in, no sightings were reported, and no debris was found on shore. The community had to move forward, knowing that answers would probably never come. On September 10th, 1988, so almost 10 years later, a team of researchers stepped off a boat and onto Sabila Island. This is one of several that make up the Taongi Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The islands of the atoll are little more than strips of sand that barely poke out of the Pacific Ocean. And Sabila is the atoll's largest island, but that isn't saying much. It's barely more than a sandbar. From end to end is about 3 miles, its widest point is just 1,000 feet, and its highest point is just a few feet above sea level. Sandy beaches border a large area of vegetation that occupies the middle of the island, but very little wildlife is there. Sea turtles will lay and hatch eggs in the sand, and nesting birds occasionally stop to rest here before heading somewhere less remote, but that's about it. And not only is Sabila too small to support much wildlife, the few plants that are found here aren't really nutritious for humans. Then on top of everything else, the waters surrounding the island are home to very few fish. All of this is to say that Sabila Island is literally one of the loneliest and most inhospitable places in the world. But in any case, the researchers were commissioned by the Marshallese government to evaluate the islands to find one that would be a good home for a wildlife sanctuary. The island wasn't a leading candidate, but the researchers were still going to be thorough. They were only there for a short time when they came across what looked like a large piece of debris partially buried in the sand. The researchers had frequently come across debris and litter from humans that washed up on the shores of other islands they had visited, but this was different. This island was so remote that even human litter rarely washed up here, yet somehow they were staring at what looked to be a battered fiberglass hull of a fishing boat sitting about 50 yards inland from the shore. One of the researchers then examined the hull for a registration number. It was faded, but he could make out the 2 letters that started it, HA. The researcher immediately knew that it was registered in Hawaii, but he had no idea what it was doing there. Sabila Island is more than 2,300 miles southwest of Hawaii, and unless you were a scientist or nesting bird, you didn't intentionally end up there. The researcher then walked around the boat to see if he could find a name, but it had also become nearly illegible. The only letters he could make out were S, A, H, and J. The moment he saw them, though, he flashed back to about 9 years earlier on a search he assisted in for a boat that went missing off Maui in a storm. He couldn't prove it immediately, but he had a feeling he was looking at what remained of the Sarah Joe. Before jumping to conclusions, though, he looked for any clues that might tell him who the boat belonged to or how it got there. He then began scanning the interior of the boat, and amid the faded, chipped blue paint were human bones. There was no doubt by then, John Naughton was standing in front of the Sarah Joe. Now, John was a scientist, and by nature he was analytical and skeptical, but the coincidence was baffling. It was improbable enough for the Sarah Joe to end up there, but it was practically impossible for it to end up there and be discovered by someone involved in the initial search. John then put the research on hold and organized a search of the island, assigning an area to each of the scientists with him. As he searched the area around the boat, he spotted something interesting. It was a crude cross fashioned out of driftwood sticking out of the sand. At its base was a pile of flat coral shingles, and wedged in the rocks was a stack of papers. It was square, 3 inches on each side, and about 3/4 of an inch thick. The paper was blank, but woven within the pages were sheets of what looked like aluminum foil. There was nothing binding the papers together, and it looked like someone attempted to light it on fire as some of the stack was singed. Then, turning his attention back to the rock pile, John saw that sitting atop the pile was a human jawbone. He could immediately see fillings in the teeth, which he knew would help with identifying who the bones belonged to, but he suddenly started to doubt his hunch that this was the Sarah Joe. The bones he saw in the hull and the jawbone in the rocks didn't have nearly 9 years of bleaching. At most, he estimated they had probably been exposed to the elements for maybe 4 or 5 years. The discovery of the jawbone told John that there were likely more human remains under the cross. He was tempted to dig them up, but the Marshallese on the research team were superstitious about disturbing the dead, so he decided against it. The team's search of the island also turned up the remains of a styrofoam cooler from Hawaii, a few glass balls that were used as fishing floats, and some other litter that could be connected to the boat. One thing immediately stood out, though. The debris was found on the ocean side of the island, while the hull was discovered on the lagoon side, which was protected from the ocean. That'll become important in a minute. After leaving the island, John reported what he found to officials. The Coast Guard then arranged for a boat to transport a search team and 2 forensics experts from the Army Identification Lab to Sabila Island. Once they were at the gravesite, the forensics experts agreed with John's assessment. The bones didn't look like they had been exposed to elements for almost a decade. The grave itself also didn't appear to be that old either. It was shallow too, so the forensics experts barely had to dig before they were pulling bones from the grave and cataloging them. When they returned to the lab, the team looked up the boat by its manufacturer's number and confirmed that it was the hull of the Sarah Joe. Upon learning this, the Coast Guard immediately reopened the case. Using dental records of the 5 missing men, strangely, the lab concluded that all the bones were from the same person, and that person was Scott. They couldn't determine a cause of death or when Scott might have died, but the bones were obviously an incredibly confusing find. He was soon returned to his family and given a proper burial, but once he was laid to rest, there were a ton more questions. How did Scott end up on Sabila Island? And was he dead before the Sergio washed him on shore, or was he still alive? And in either case, who buried him? Up until then, the story of the 5 men hadn't become a story anywhere else outside of Hawaii until the discovery of Scott's remains. The story then began to get more attention, and in 1989, the TV series Unsolved Mysteries arrived in Hana to produce a story on the disappearance. Many of the residents who got involved in the search got to play themselves in the recreation the show filmed. When the show finally aired, all of Hana tuned in. In the days that followed, everyone anticipated some sort of tip or any new information, but sadly, the story produced nothing new. So in 1990, the families hired Steve Goodnow, a private investigator from Honolulu, to make sense of everything and take a fresh look at the case. The odds weren't in his favor though. It had been so long since the men went missing that the chances of finding any further evidence seemed unlikely. His investigation started on Sabila Island with Robert and a friend of his. Steve needed to see it all for himself, and one of Steve's biggest motivations for visiting the island was to see if the Coast Guard missed anything. After their polarizing initial search when the men were reported missing, a second look couldn't hurt. As it turned out, he was exactly right. Steve found items that didn't turn up in the Coast Guard search. He timed his visit to the island with low tide so he could walk the outer reef. That's where he found the Sergio's main engine wedged in the reef. Elsewhere on the island, Steve found a handful more small bones that belonged to Scott. Steve was then able to start piecing together a theory of what happened, but he needed to question a lot more people connected to the disappearance, and he was going to start with the Marshallese officials. During his questioning of the Marshallese officials, Steve heard about a Marshallese boat that was patrolling near the atoll several years ago and caught a Taiwanese vessel illegally fishing the waters nearby. A crewman on the boat reported to Marshallese officials that he saw what looked like a grave on Sabila Island, but officials did nothing with this information. When Steve was done with his questioning, he had few definitive answers, but plenty of information and evidence to come up with a pretty good theory of what happened to the Sergio and its passengers. What follows is the theory that Steve developed through his investigation. On February 11th, 1979, the 5 men boarded the Sergio, headed out of Hana Bay, and turned south to enter the channel. Whether they made it to the fishing spot or not, the storm came fast. When they spotted it, they turned around to head back when the engine died. The ocean was extremely rough by then, and the 7.5 horsepower backup motor was no match for the ocean swells. Steve believes it's very likely that the men were powerless against the storm and subject to wherever it or the current was going to take them. Because of the storm's path and his study of the currents, he believed the boat would have been carried northwest by the storm, probably at least 200 miles. If the coast of Kauai was within sight of the boat, it might have been enough to tempt some of the men into making a swim for it. There's no way to tell how many of them might have attempted this, or if any of them did at all, but Steve speculates that some of them drowned trying to reach Kauai. When the storm passed, the strong surface currents of the Pacific took over and pushed the boat west-southwest. If that's what happened, Steve estimated that it would have taken 2 or 3 months for the Sergio to travel more than 2,300 miles. What happened during that time was open to speculation, but Steve thought 2 scenarios were the most likely. Either Scott was alive and alone when the Sergio arrived on Sabila Island, or he was alone on the boat and died due to dehydration or starvation before the boat wrecked on Sabila Island. And Steve leaned toward the latter being true. To survive 2 or 3 months on the ocean with what little supplies he had available was unlikely, although not impossible. If Scott had been able to gather rainwater, there's a chance he might have survived the journey, but a piece of evidence Steve found during the investigation seemed to not support that. Where the outside of the hull meets the interior, Steve discovered some of Scott's hair and theorized that it ended up there after a long period of decomposition when a clump of the hair separated from Scott's body. Then at some point after Scott's body arrived on Sabila Island, a Taiwanese fishing boat came across the Sergio, either in the ocean or by spotting the wreck in the sand from their boat. When they saw Scott's remains inside the hull, the fishermen gathered them and placed them in a shallow grave. They then must have performed some kind of ceremony during the burial. The stack of square papers found at Scott's grave was too similar to those used in a Taiwanese funeral custom to be a coincidence. In Taiwan, the deceased are often buried with a stack of square papers and gold or silver sheets between the pages. The stacks are sometimes burned too as a sort of funeral pyre. Analysis of the driftwood cross also pointed toward the likelihood that Scott was buried by fishermen in the area. The nails used to hold the cross together were the same kind found on commercial fishing vessels. Steve concluded that the fishermen never reported this because they were fishing the area illegally. With all of that said though, Steve's theory was solid, but it wasn't airtight. The boat being on the lagoon side of the island was harder to explain. Entering the lagoon was like threading a needle, seeming to suggest human intervention, especially given other garbage was found on the ocean side. If a human hadn't been involved, you'd expect it all to end up in the same spot. With that also said though, even if it was unlikely that the ocean managed to carry the boat through the tight opening, it wasn't impossible. Steve also couldn't resolve the issue of the bones being found to not have enough bleaching for him to have died during or after the storm. And then there was also one more piece of evidence that was discovered and threatened most of Steve's theory. Between the disappearance of the Sarah Joe in 1979 and its reported discovery in 1988, the islands nearby, including Sabila, were research stopped for teams doing geological surveys. Each of these studies was thorough and detailed, yet even studies published as late as 1986 contained no mention of a boat hull or a grave. This, more than any other piece of evidence, raises the kind of questions that turn the case on its head. If the boat and the grave were on the island when the research teams were there, how did they overlook them? And if the boat and grave weren't there when the teams were, where was the Sarah Joe for upwards of 6 years? If it was drifting in the ocean the whole time with Scott's remains in the uncovered hull, why did the bleaching of the bones suggest that they had only been exposed to sun and salt for a few years? Could this mean that Scott initially ended up on a different island where he survived for years before dying on the boat during an attempt to find civilization? And if he did survive on another island for a while, were any of the other men with him there? It's now been more than 40 years since the boat disappeared and more than 30 since it was recovered, yet there are still few answers. No trace of the other men has ever been found, no other evidence has ever washed up on other islands, and no explanation has been offered for how the boat and the grave weren't seen by multiple research teams. It does seem likely that Scott was buried by fishermen, but there's no way of knowing when, where, or how they found Scott. So that's where things were left. The families of Ralph, Peter, and Benny still live in Hana and are close with one another. They recently got together for the 40th anniversary of their disappearance and shared memories of the loved ones with each other. What remained of the Sarah Joe was released back to Robert in the 1990s. As for what he thinks happened in 1979, Robert believes that the four of them, including his brother, were tossed from the boat by ocean swells during the storm and that Scott managed to stay aboard by tying himself to the boat. Robert figures that Scott probably died of dehydration in the days that followed. And he might be right or he might be wrong. All he knows for sure is that he'll likely never know. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. And a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.